Picture a serene French village, sometime in the late medieval period. It is a quiet afternoon, and the local convent is expected to be a place of meditative silence and holy hymns. Instead, the stone walls are vibrating, with the sound of a massive, uncoordinated cat concert. It isn't just one stray animal. Every single nun in the building is meowing at the top of her lungs. This isn't a quick joke or a fleeting moment of levity. This collective caterwauling continues for several hours. Every single day, for a week. The surrounding villagers aren't just confused. They are genuinely terrified because, in the medieval mind, cats were the chosen mascots of Satan. Eventually, the local authorities decided that the appropriate response to a group of women having a collective psychological breakdown wasn't medical aid or spiritual counseling. It was military intervention. They stationed a platoon of soldiers outside the convent, with orders to whip any woman who continued to make a sound. This is the history of the Meowing Nuns, and while it sounds like a surrealist sketch, it is actually a case study in how systems of total control create the very madness they use to justify violence. And as weird as the cats were, the collective hysteria was only just getting started. 1491 in France is the most famous example, but it was hardly an isolated event. In religious orders across France and Germany during the 15th century, the inhabitants began to exhibit what contemporary sources called barking mad behavior. One nun in a large French convent began the trend, and her sisters soon followed suit until the entire institution was overcome with a cat imitation plague. If that sounds bizarre, consider the German nunnery, where a different spirit took hold instead of meowing. A nun began biting her companions. Within a few days, the behavior spread, until the entire convent was full of women, running around and biting each other viciously. This biting frenzy proved to be remarkably contagious, traveling from convent to convent throughout a great part of Germany, particularly Saxony, then moving into the nunneries of the Netherlands, and eventually crossing the Alps into Rome. Other outbreaks saw nuns jumping out of trees to imitate birds, racing around on all fours, like dogs, or clawing their way up tree trunks in the manner of cats. At the time, the church had one explanation: demonic possession. If a group of women were acting like animals, it must be because the devil was pulling the strings. The authorities watched in horror as these nuns committed what one chronicler grimly described as worrying one another from Rome to Amsterdam, never realizing that this feral behavior was the inevitable byproduct of the holy warehouses they were forced to call home. To understand why a woman might choose to meow like a cat until a soldier threatens to whip her, we have to look at what convent life actually looked like in the Middle Ages. For many women, the convent was not a sanctuary. It was a warehouse for surplus daughters. Families of the nobility and the merchant class often forced their girls into religious life against their will, because marriage dowries were expensive. This was less of a spiritual calling and more of a cold-blooded financial disposal system. If a father couldn't afford to marry off a second or third daughter, he simply packed her off to a convent where she was compelled to take vows of celibacy, poverty, and total obedience to authority figures she didn't choose. Once accepted into these orders, they were condemned to a life of absolute austerity and grueling manual labor. These women were effectively entering a prison-like environment, where they were expected to be perfect vessels for God, while their actual daily reality consisted of regimented contemplation and exhaustion. There were zero exit options once those walls closed behind them, and the system was designed to ensure that any flicker of a woman's original personality was extinguished in favor of unquestioning obedience. The daily routine was a relentless, crushing cycle of prayer, silence, and hard work, all maintained through a sophisticated system of coercive measures. Authority figures, mother superiors, and priests held the right to compel compliance, using tactics that would be considered human rights violations in any other context. Punishments for minor infractions or perceived defiance included the imposition of extra manual labor, being confined for days in tiny cells, or having basic necessities like food and water withheld. Physical chastisement was a standard in-house feature of convent management, ranging from caning to regular floggings. If a nun proved particularly hard-headed, the threat of being turned over to an ecclesiastic court, where the end result was often being burned to death for witchcraft or possession. These women lived in a state of communal, long-standing stress and fear, existing in a world where even their internal desires were treated as evidence of eternal damnation. They were constantly taught that as the tainted heirs of Eve, they were naturally more liable to succumb to Satan. a misogynistic trope that only served to heighten their psychological fragility. These institutions were toxic psychological environments, ripe for what we now call mass psychogenic illness. Mass hysteria often flourishes in cohesive, segregated groups experiencing long-standing stresses and fears. By the 1400s, an evangelical reform movement began sweeping through these communities to restore harsh spiritual codes, which meant even blander food, the removal of pillows from beds, and the banning of music and conversation. Reformers instructed nuns to consume only the blandest fare and spurn all vanity, often leading to a life of total sensory deprivation. It was frequently the arrival of these reformist mother superiors that triggered the outbreaks, as many nuns, who had originally come from wealthy backgrounds, did not adjust well to a life of abstinence and self-abasement. When the burden of being a perfect vessel for God became too much to bear, the human mind found the only escape hatch available: a dissociative state. If you couldn't scream for help in your own voice, perhaps you could meow it. This pattern of collective breakdown repeated itself for over 400 years across France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy. For the nuns, the environment of belief they lived in, one saturated with devils and demons, provided the only vocabulary they had to express their agony. But as the centuries rolled on, the Church's patience for these performances evaporated, and in 1749, the state's response to a group of screaming women turned cold-bloodedly lethal. By 1749, the pattern had reached its darkest endpoint. The Wurzburg screaming epidemic centered on Sister Maria Renata Singer, a sub-prioress who had lived in the Unterzell nunnery for half a century. This wasn't some young, impressionable girl. She was a woman who had given 50 years of her life to this institution. The chaos began when a young woman prone to convulsions was admitted to the convent, despite Maria Renata initially trying to deny her entry. Once this young woman was inside, the other sisters began to imitate her behavior, and the situation rapidly spiraled into a scene of frantic delirium. Soon, the convent was full of nuns screaming, writhing, foaming at the mouth, and entering trance-like states during religious services. As the behavior spread through the community, a dying nun pointed the finger at Maria Renata, accusing her of working black magic. This accusation acted as a catalyst, and everything snowballed as other nuns got into the act, often performing their own fits in the throes of public exorcisms. The Church didn't stop at whipping this time. Maria Renata was subjected to intense confinement and interrogation. Eventually, after what must have been an unbearable process, she was coerced into confessing to being a witch for more than 60 years. Her trial and subsequent execution became a theological football in a world that was supposedly entering the Age of Enlightenment. Despite the rationalist spirit of the mid-18th century, the authorities were desperate for a final defense against those who dared to stop believing in witches or demons. Maria Renata's sentence was moderated from being burned alive to being beheaded first, a small mercy for 50 years of reclusive service. On the morning of her execution, her head was struck off and mounted on a pole, and her body was burned to ashes in a massive public display. Her confessor, the Jesuit Georg Gar, used her cremation as a platform to preach a sermon, praising the wise severity of the laws against such crimes. He told the gathered crowds that Maria Renata's death was a direct warning from God to anyone who doubted the reality of magic or the devil. Witnesses at the scene even reported seeing a vulture appear in the smoke as her body burned, a detail used to cement the idea that her possession was real. The madness of the other nuns miraculously ended the moment their sub-prioress's head was mounted on a pole. It is a clean, terrifying ending to a story that, ironically, might be much harder to prove than the executioners would have liked. If you try to find the original primary documents for the famous Meowing Nuns story today, you will encounter what modern researchers call the murky truth. Most modern accounts point back to a single book from 1844 called The Epidemics of the Middle Ages by Justus Hecker. But the story isn't actually in Hecker's original German text. It's a footnote added by his translator, Benjamin Guy Babington. Babington claims he read about it in a good medical work, but he doesn't name it. Another version appears 50 years earlier in a book called Solitude by a Swiss doctor named Zimmermann. Zimmermann cites a French medical writer of great merit, but again provides no name. This lack of a solid paper trail has led some to wonder if the story was embellished or even fabricated to mock the wild imaginations of women. Zimmermann himself wrote that the female mind was more subject to disordered fancy, Yet the meowing story is so consistent with documented cases of convent hysteria like the biting nuns or the screaming nuns of Wurzburg, that its literal truth almost matters less than its symbolic truth. Whether or not every detail of the meowing incident is accurate, it remains a powerful representation of a documented historical reality. Women were trapped in a system that gave them no voice, so they found another way to be heard. Because when you suppress the human voice for long enough, the human body inevitably finds a way to scream. When we zoom out, we can see that meowing, biting, and screaming were not symptoms of a disease. They were a form of resistance. When a person is placed in a high-stress, closed environment where every normal avenue of expression is forbidden, the brain creates a new one. This is what mass psychogenic illness actually is: a physical response to an intolerable psychological situation. The church and the nobility chose to see this as demonic possession, or insanity, because those labels allowed them to avoid looking at the prison-like conditions they had created. If the nuns were possessed, then the system was still holy, and the only solution was to beat the devil out of them. It is a classic move of systemic gaslighting, taking a logical reaction to an insane environment and labeling the victim as the crazy one. We still see versions of this today. The laughing epidemic in a strict Tanzanian boarding school in 1962, modern clusters of tick-like behaviors spreading through social media and Malaysian schools, where authorities respond to screaming outbreaks by cutting down trees rather than examining the conditions students are forced to live in. The mechanism has not changed. The meowing nuns weren't barking mad. They were women who had reached the absolute limit of what the human spirit can endure, and they chose to meow in the face of a world that refused to let them speak. If you're curious about how collective anxiety can boil over into the streets, look into the dancing plagues of the 16th century, but for now, remember that sometimes irrational behavior is the only honest response to an irrational world.